Hello everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of UCTV Alive for Kids. Today we've got Kristyn Harman from the University of Tasmania on the show. Kristyn works in the area of history at the university, and she's going to tell us about the Aboriginal men who were forced to become convicts. So you might be like me and you might not realise that there were Aboriginal men who were forced to become convicts. This is a part of our history that I didn't know about, and it's really important that we learn about it. But it's also really important before we start that we recognise and acknowledge, especially as UCTV Alive for Kids is all about sharing information and sharing knowledge. It's really important that we acknowledge and recognise that Aboriginal people in Tasmania were the first knowledge holders and the first information sharers in this country. And we're very honoured today to be able to film on Lutruwita Aboriginal country. So we pay our respects and we acknowledge past and present Aboriginal people for sharing the knowledge that they did and for continuing to share their knowledge. We also must note before we get started that Kristyn's presentation will contain images and illustrations of Aboriginal people who are now deceased. So please keep that in mind while you're viewing Kristyn's presentation. All right then, we're going to get started and we're going to introduce Kristyn. Thank you so much, Kristyn, for coming on the show. Welcome.
Hello everyone, and look, thanks so much for inviting me along today to share some of my research with you.
Great. What will you be talking to us about today, Kristyn?
I'm going to be talking about history, which is an area I work in and am really passionate about. But as part of that history, I want to talk about perhaps some of the more difficult moments in Australia's past relating to Aboriginal people and how they did end up incorporated into the convict system.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristyn, for coming on the show. You've got a PowerPoint presentation as well to show us. Did you want to get stuck into that now?
Yes, let's make a start with the PowerPoint. One of the things about being a historian, I think, is that we're very much like detectives. We look for clues, but those clues are things that have survived today from the past. And the past might be just a few years ago, it could be decades ago. In my case, I'm mostly looking at the 18th and 19th century. But before I start looking for clues, I need to know why. So basically, I start off with at least one research question so that I know what it is that I want to look for that will help me answer that question. You might think I sound a little bit different from other people you've heard. That's because I'm actually from New Zealand. When I moved to Tasmania quite a long time ago, I visited one of your amazing places here, and that led me to a research question. I wonder if any of you might recognise this place that I went to all those years ago.
If you do recognise it, you can send in your answer using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You could get your teacher to type the answer in, or if you're at home watching it, you could type it in yourself. But we're really interested to know, can you guess what this place is?
Some of you might have been here like I have, and you have to cross a stretch of water, the Mercury Passage, to get there. It is, of course, Darlington on Maria Island. When I was over at Maria Island, I walked up the hill where there's a colonial graveyard, and while I was there, I saw this large headstone. And for me, newly arrived from New Zealand, it was a really poignant moment. It was really emotionally moving because I saw that here was a Māori man, Hohepa Tiomara, who had been buried on Maria Island in 1847, and I thought, what on earth was a Māori person doing in Tasmania back in the old days when it was called Van Diemen's Land? Anyway, I eventually started to find some answers to that question. I found out that it has something to do with Australia's convict past. As lots of you, I'm sure, have probably already studied or know about, back in 1788, the first fleet of 11 ships came to Australia. They came to what is now New South Wales. And on those ships were the first of the male and female convicts that were brought out to Australia. There were lots and lots of different types of convicts. So on the ship, not only were there Christian convicts, there were Jewish convicts, there were some convicts that used to be enslaved peoples that had originally come from Africa. All sorts of different people were on the first fleet. And right from the very start, the convict system, where all the prisoners were kept and worked, they were from lots of different countries and backgrounds. A lot of them were from England and Ireland, but I think it's important we know they were also from other places as well.
Why is it, Kristyn, that it's mostly the English and the Irish convicts that we know about?
I think because they were the majority, and also the English were the people that first decided that they should set up a settlement here, and they decided to invade New South Wales to do that. And so they used to send English prisoners to colonies they had in the Americas, but after the American Revolution they couldn't do that anymore, so they were looking for some new land to sail to.
Okay.
Yeah, so they decided to come to New South Wales, even though there were already Aboriginal people living there, and that they would set up their own settlement. So as part of that, over time the settlements grew, and Sydney got established, and then Hobart was the second big establishment, right where we are broadcasting from today. And I found out that over at Maria Island, there was in fact what is called a convict probation station. That was a special place to which a lot of male convicts were sent to serve part of their sentence. And you can see from this picture I'm sharing with you that that's actually some remains of a cell block where the prisoners were locked up overnight on the island. Yeah, so if you go over there today, you can see quite a few of the buildings that date back to that particular time. One of the things I also think is really interesting that not a lot of people might know about is, like, growing up in New Zealand, I heard about how convicts sailed out in the ships to the Australian colonies, and that these were mostly either from England or from the colonies that the British had established. But like lots of other people also ended up shipping convicts around the world. So over 500 years, which is a long time, more than 500 years, the French were sending convicts to places. That's where the purple circles are on the world map. The British to the pink places, the Spanish to the yellow places, and the Portuguese where the green circles are. If you look really carefully at the numbers too, you might see there that the Andaman Islands actually had more of the British convicts than either New South Wales or Van Diemen's Land received.
I can just see that now, sort of to the right of the screen. That really big red circle. That's a huge number.
It is, and it really, I think it's really quite surprising to those of us growing up in Australia and New Zealand to find there were other places convicts were sent to, even more convicts than sent to Van Diemen's Land, or Tasmania as we now call it. And also that really the other big European empires were doing the same sort of thing. And that was really because they were invading other people's lands. They wanted to set up colonies, and by sending their prisoners there, or convicts, that gave them a lot of labour. So the convicts had to build roads and grow vegetables and make buildings and things. So that was all part of what was going on. So that left a question in my mind. I was thinking, okay, so Maria Island was a place convicts went to. There was a Maori man buried there who was a convict. But if there were Maori convicts from New Zealand, what about Australia? Did Australia put Aboriginal people into the convict system? And if they did, how did they do that? So to start finding answers, I had a look at colonial newspapers.
Wow.
They weren't exactly like these paper ones. I'd actually been filmed, and I had to look at these long reels of film through a special viewing thing that I read them through. Now you can look them up on Trove through the National Library. They're online and they're much easier for you to search.
They must be a lot easier to look at.
They're a lot easier to look at. One of the funny things about these colonial newspapers is that they people spoke a little bit differently and they write a little bit differently, but you soon get used to it. So I found out from the newspapers and looking at people that were thought to have committed offences, so they did something that upset the authorities, they would have to appear before the court. And some of those people would be sentenced to transportation. That meant they had to be shipped to a penal colony and serve their sentence. So all in all, I found that about 90 Aboriginal men, mostly from New South Wales, ended up being transported as convicts. And I want to tell you a little bit about one of those men. This man lived around what we now know as Sydney, and the colonists gave him a nickname, and that nickname was Mosquito. Mosquito was really well known in this area. So this is an old painting of the Hawkesbury River, and he lived in that area with his people. One of the problems that occurred though, as more and more and more of the British came, they too wanted access to the fresh water and all of the resources that came along with that. So you might think about fish, you might think about crops that could grow by the river where the soil was nice and rich and fertile. More and more and more people came, and they pushed Aboriginal people further up the river and away from lands where they had lived for thousands of years. So Mosquito and other people ended up trying to fight the colonists and drive them off their lands so that they could have their lands back and their resources. One of the things that happened about that though is that the colonial authorities would try and catch Aboriginal people that were doing this, and they could end up perhaps putting them in jail, and that's what happened with Mosquito. To find out more about what he was doing, as well as looking at newspapers, I could look at other letters and things in the archives. And also these books here, these big books are held in libraries, like at the university. And they're called Historical Records of Australia. And they're actually typed out versions of letters, lots and lots and lots of letters that some of the main leaders in the colony had sent back to England, and the answers they got. So you can sometimes read about people like Mosquito and what's happened to them, or lots of other people as well, in books like this, and learn about those times.
There are a lot of letters there. Do you find a lot in the library when you go to do your research, Kristyn?
No, the library's really a really useful place to start, and the librarians are usually very friendly and helpful as well, so they can help people to find, resources to look at where we might find more clues about the past. So it can be pretty exciting, but sometimes it can also be pretty sad depending what you find out. Mm-hmm. So I found out from looking at the historic sources and from letters and newspapers that Mosquito was actually banished by the governor, and in the very early 1800s, around 1805, he was sent to this place, which is actually Norfolk Island. Mm-hmm. So this was a penal station where prisoners were sent, and they had to perform labour, and Mosquito actually had to be an assistant to a charcoal burner. So the picture you can see here is a charcoal burner. You can see it's a very dirty sort of job, quite hard labour, and Mosquito was actually the assistant, so it was probably one of the lowest and dirtiest jobs at Norfolk Island.
And you were saying, Kristyn, that he was sent to this penal station. Is a penal station just another word for a place that convicts go, or is a penal station a place that prisoners in general go?
A penal station was considered to be, it's sometimes also called a punishment station, so it's kind of for people that are considered to be the worst criminals. Mm-hmm. A probation station, like we saw at Maria Island, is a slightly more gentle place where people, they might learn to make shoes, or they grow vegetables and they do trades, whereas a penal station, like Norfolk Island's further away, really hard to escape from. And the people sent there, they might have been already sent from England, and they might have done something else wrong. And so they would be sent to this more harsh place. So Mosquito was there, but then the settlement at Norfolk Island was actually shut down. It was expensive to run, and the harbour was really hard to enter. So he, along with a number of other convicts who were still left there, actually got sent on a ship called the Minstrel, and they came to Van Diemen's Land, as Tasmania used to be called. And you might see his name there if you look under the letter M, mosquito, written with 2 T's. Yeah, so this is a plaque in St David's Square in Hobart.
Yeah. Do you know if there are any other Aboriginal men in that list of names?
I don't believe there are other Aboriginal men in this list of names, but some people in Tasmania have told me that some of these people, they're descended from some of these people, so this might be their great-great-great-great-grandfather or grandmother on this list. Mm-hmm. So this is on an actual kind of monument in St David's Park in Hobart, so people could go and have a look at if they're in Hobart and want to find it. So after Mosquito came here, like lots of other convicts, people got sent to be a servant of a man or a woman who lived in the colony. This is Edward Lord, and at one point Mosquito was working for Edward Lord. So he might have been doing work like being a shepherd or that sort of work, but also he used to be sent out to help track bushrangers. So they were convicts who had escaped from the system and were living in the bush. A little bit like highwaymen or highway robbers, holding up people and stealing from other people to get by. But over time, Mosquito left his assigned service and he ended up living with a group of Tasmanian Aboriginal people that the colonists called the Tame Mob. And with them, he moved around mostly the east coast of Tasmania and the Midlands. And again, like in Sydney, around Sydney, Aboriginal people here were trying to fight to reclaim their lands, their country and their resources. And eventually, after a particular altercation, Mosquito got in trouble and he ended up being arrested. And after having to appear in court, he and another Tasmanian Aboriginal man and some bushrangers, unfortunately, all ended up being hanged outside this building, which is part of the penitentiary or jail in Hobart. That's the penitentiary chapel. So I ended up writing about all of these Aboriginal convicts in my PhD thesis. That's this big book here.
It's gigantic.
It's about 95,000 words, so it's like a really, really long story with all the evidence I found, and it's quite big and heavy. So
it
one
looks
day,
really heavy.
some of you could do one. If you ever want to go to university and you first of all do your bachelor's degree and honours, later on you can do a PhD and write maybe 80 to 100,000 words like that. So this still left a question for me. What happened to Haipa Te Omeroa? What was his story? So again, back to the newspapers. This time I could have a look at the New Zealand ones, which are available online through the National Library there, just like Australian ones are available through the National Library here. I found out that it was a little bit like the story around Sydney. There's a beautiful valley near Wellington, a lovely river, very rich lands. Māori had lived on them for generations. And then the British turned up and they thought they had bought this land from some Māori, but another Māori group said, well, actually it was our land and you've spoken to the wrong people. You can see there a farm, Mr. Bulcott's farm. It was made into a stockade to protect it from attacks. But, you know, there was conflict between Māori and the white people they called Pākehā. A group of Māori were later captured after attacking this particular place. And I read the court-martial. They were actually court-martialed in New Zealand. And at the end of the court-martial, they ended up being sentenced to be transported for life, and they were sent to Hobart.
What's court-martialed? Sorry, Kristyn?
Court-martialed is a military process, so instead of going to the civilian court, what had happened in Wellington was that martial law had been proclaimed over the whole area. That really meant that soldiers were now in charge.
Okay.
So it was very controversial. But when the Māori were captured, they had to go before like a military hearing instead of a judge with his, you know, white cap, his white curly cap and things. So they were sent to Hobart, and the governor in New Zealand, George Grey, wanted them sent to Port Arthur. He thought they should really be punished severely. But when the men arrived in Hobart in their beautiful traditional costumes and carrying Bibles under their arms, local Hobart people were quite shocked and dismayed and didn't think these men should have to go to Port Arthur. Their portraits, you can see their watercolour portraits here, they were painted by a famous artist called John Skinner Prout, who was in Hobart at the time. The men were in the penitentiary. Have a really close look. You can see how each man, well, you can see it particularly on Hohepa Tuamara's in the middle. He's the man standing in the middle. See how he's written his own name in pencil.
Oh, yeah.
On his portrait. And each man has, some of them you might not quite see because of the cropping of the images, but each man wrote his own name. And these beautiful paintings are at the British Museum in London. I was lucky to go and be able to see them there. So these men ended up instead at Maria Island, as I said, a sort of more gentle place than Port Arthur, a probation station. And luckily we can know quite a lot about what happened from day to day because their overseer kept a diary, and this got typed out by someone later, about the sort of things they did. So they used to say their prayers, do schoolwork, grow vegetables, you know, maybe hunt possums, that sort of thing.
Search for crayfish, I can see.
Yeah, so they got to have quite a gentle experience in the convict system, because in the meantime we were waiting in Tasmania for a letter to come back from London about what to do with the men. But before the men could be sent home, which is what happened to most of them, Hohepa Tuamara caught tuberculosis, a disease of the lungs that was quite common back in the 19th century, and he died at Maria Island. So this is a picture from his conduct record. In Hobart, we're lucky to have a lot of these records that have been saved from back in the 19th century, and they're so important that these thousands of pages of records have been inscribed on what's called this like World Heritage Register that UNESCO keeps, the memory of the world. So it's quite remarkable, and so have some of the buildings. And so that really takes us back almost to where we started with Hohepa Tuamara's headstone, which was quarried from the island, and the headstone itself really is a really noted historic source. That still stands there. If you visit Maria Island, you can walk up the hill to the cemetery and see it. But fortunately, I think in 1988, some of his descendants came from New Zealand and they took Hohepa Tuamara's remains back home so that he could be reburied in his traditional country. So that was almost 150 years after he'd been sent here. So I think it was really special that he could return home.
And you were saying at the beginning, Kristyn, that a lot of the Aboriginal men that were forced to become convicts were from the mainland?
Yes, so they were largely from New South Wales, and it surprised me, being from New Zealand, when I first came here, to find out that back in the early times, in the early 1900s, the 19th century, that New South Wales used to include what we now call Queensland and Victoria. So New South Wales used to be way, way bigger.
Yeah, what I was wondering, Kristyn, was whether the remains of those Aboriginal men, if any of them have been able to be returned to their country so they can be buried on country.
At the moment, I don't believe so. There were quite a few deaths of people in the convict system. Aboriginal people, very sadly, were about 10 times more likely to die in the convict system than, say, white men being sent from England. So it's my belief and understanding that at least one Aboriginal convict is buried on Isle of the Dead at Port Arthur.
Okay.
We don't know exactly what happened to everybody's remains, but I mean, quite happily, there were a few Aboriginal convicts who survived their sentence to transportation and did actually return home to New South Wales.
Okay, well that's good. That's really good.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you would like to tell us at this stage, Kristyn, or should we go to a question and answer break?
I'm really happy to hear questions that anyone might have, actually. Although first, actually, I do have something I meant to show you. So it's quite big. I just have to lift it up. When people were sentenced to transportation and became convicts, one of the bits of paper that might be sent with them was a warrant.
It's gigantic.
And,
It's even bigger than your PhD.
It's really huge. So this great big piece of paper actually came out on a sailing ship from the Cape Colony. That's now part of what we call South Africa. And this was actually for an Indigenous person from there. He had been a soldier. He was a young man in his 20s. But when he deserted from his regiment, taking with him his uniform and other things, he ended up being captured. He was sentenced to transportation and sent all the way here on a ship. The ships used to stop at the Cape Colony sometimes on their way around from England. And this piece of paper came out with him right back then. It's very big.
Yes, it's very big.
I have one other thing to show you. You might recognise this person because when after I finished my PhD, I wrote a book. And there's Mosquito on the cover. So this book's about the Aboriginal men mostly from the mainland who were sent as convicts to the different places around Australia. But it's also about the Māori men sent from New Zealand to here, and also people from the Cape Colony like Boy Pete, whose warrant I just showed you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristyn. We will cross to a question and answer break. Please send in as many questions as you have and we will chat to you in 5 minutes. Thank you. Hello everyone, welcome back. Thank you so much for sending in so many questions during the break. We really enjoyed reading through them. So 2 people asked about, Kristyn had mentioned in her presentation about that there were more deaths of Aboriginal people than the European convicts. So Newnham campus and Sarah have both asked why were the Aboriginal convicts 10 times more likely to die than a non-Aboriginal convict? Why was it the case? What was the cause of the death?
Look, that is such a good question, and it's something that really troubled me and I looked into in quite a lot of detail. Mm-hmm. So there were actually some really key reasons why this happened. One of the really important ones was that when the men were captured, they were really involved in what we might call frontier warfare between colonists and Aboriginal people. Mm-hmm. So as part of the fighting, when the men were captured, they were sometimes injured, sometimes even quite badly injured, and then they were put into jail. So it was mm-hmm. really hard for those injuries to be able to heal and for the men to get well again. Another reason, I think, is that in Aboriginal cultures and societies, jailing people wasn't really part of culture. Mm-hmm. So being imprisoned in these dark, dank, cold prisons really had an impact on people's physical and mental health. They also had been living very classic or traditional lifestyles. So suddenly, instead of perhaps hunting kangaroo and gathering bush tucker and things like that, they were suddenly having to eat convict rations, which, you know, might have been salt beef and some bread and a few vegetables. A very big change in diet. And also having like old blankets and things. And in fact, one girl who lived on Norfolk Island that we looked at briefly in the presentation, she wrote in her diary that one of the Aboriginal prisoners sent there, an older man in his 60s called Janam Gurner, he cried every time he thought of home. Another thing happens that people talk about is pining for country. So he missed home so much that it made him really sad. So I think all of those different things together made people more, you know, they became more unhealthy and died. And it was such a big deal that back in the 19th century, there was actually an inquiry into Aboriginal deaths in custody right back then.
That's so interesting, Kristyn. We also had a couple of questions from Ulverston Primary. So one of the questions was, what was the average amount of time that convicts were sentenced for?
Sure. So the amount of time convicts were sentenced for really depended on what they'd done that had seen them get into this trouble to start with. So the shortest sentence was typically for 7 years, but for some of these particular Aboriginal convicts, they were sentenced for longer than that. They could also be sentenced for 10 years, 14 years or even life. So some people were sentenced for life. I mean, it didn't mean they had to stay convicts till they actually died, although some did, but they could eventually be freed again after they'd served quite a long time in the system, maybe more than 10 to 15 years.
Wow. Alston Primary were also wondering how long the Maori men were sentenced for.
Sure, so that's really interesting because when the Maori men had to attend this court-martial in New Zealand that one of the soldiers from Australia had to sail over to run, they were sentenced to transportation for life for being an open rebellion against Queen and country, even though there was really a war. The war wasn't at that stage really acknowledged. But when they got here, the local people in Hobart didn't really agree with that outcome, and so they ended up only really serving about 2 years.
Wow.
So the four men who survived, whose other pictures you saw by Hohepatil Maraes, they were allowed to go back to New Zealand after about 2 years at Maria Island.
And when you say the local people sort of disagreed with their sentence, was that all people that lived locally, or was it mostly the European people, or was it mostly the Aboriginal people speaking out against that?
By the time the Māori arrived here in the late 1840s, Aboriginal people were mostly living on the Bass Strait Islands at that time. So it was really the colonists who had come to invade this island. And they went down, a very large group of them went down and saw the Māori arrive off the ships with their traditional dress, like in the beautiful watercolours of them. They were holding Bibles because they'd been taught by missionaries. And colonists wrote to the newspaper, they wrote to the governor wrote to England because they all thought that these men were being treated unfairly.
It's interesting. Why do you think that were they so outspoken about the Maori people but not about the Aboriginal people from Australia?
I think that's a really, really good question, and there's not really a very good answer other than to suggest perhaps that people saw Indigenous peoples from other countries as somehow being different and more special than Indigenous peoples living in the lands that they had invaded.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite complicated.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We've got a question from Sarah asking about Mosquito. So why was Mosquito hung and what was his crime? And she has also asked why was he called Mosquito?
Sure. So Mosquito wasn't the name he was given by his own people, but he and another man that was also transported to Norfolk Island with him, but who sadly died there, were both given nicknames by colonists in Sydney. So Mosquito was given the name Mosquito and the other man was called Bulldog by the colonists. I haven't seen surviving information as to why those names were chosen, but when particular Aboriginal people became recognisable to colonists, they sometimes did make up nicknames for them. Like in Tasmania, we had people that were called things like Black Jack and Black Tom and that sort of thing too.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So we've got a question from Mikey. After convicts were first sent to Tasmania, how long did it take until some of them were released to settle in Tasmania? Did they have any interactions with Aboriginal people then?
So the Aboriginal convicts or all convicts?
It just says after the convicts were first sent to Tasmania, how long did it take until some of them were released to settle in Tasmania?
Yeah, so the earliest convicts to be released would have been those who were sentenced to 7 years. And when they were released, there was a new system that was actually invented in Australia called the ticket of leave. So after they'd served most of their sentence, if they'd behaved well, or at least been seen to behave well, they hadn't been caught out doing something naughty, they could get a ticket of leave. Then they were allowed to go and live just like most other people. They had to stay in their district. They couldn't just go back to, say, England or Finland or wherever they'd been sent from. There were interactions between former convicts and Aboriginal people. Like some people formed really happy relationships. Some lived on the Bass Strait Islands. Some had less happy relationships. Some even abducted Aboriginal women, for example. And then quite a few convicts, along with other colonists, were involved in the general movement, a large military campaign against Tasmanian Aboriginal people. It's often referred to as the Black Line. That was its nickname. But at the time it was called the General Movement back in 1830. It's sort of infamous moment in the island's history.
Thank you, Kristyn. We've got another question from Sarah, who is a teacher at Cressy District High School. So she's asking about Norfolk Island. So on Norfolk Island, did they ask the wrong tribe on purpose to buy the land? Or the wrong group to buy the land?
Oh, okay. That might have been actually referring to the Hutt Valley in New Zealand.
Yes.
So Norfolk Island, as I understand it, wasn't inhabited when the British first went there. It actually has a very, very difficult harbour and it's very hard to get to, which is partly why they shut that convict settlement at that time. But no, I think in New Zealand it was confusing for the colonists who to speak to. One of the things about New Zealand is that for about half a century before the British formally colonised it, there were lots of white people going there and French people and other people. And eventually, you know, missionaries, people getting timber, hunting whales. And they ended up trading with Māori and they gave them muskets, were a really old-fashioned type of gun. And so Māori fought very bitter wars that are called the Musket Wars, and lots of Māori were killed. But that kind of had a domino effect right down the island where people, Māori, pushed other Māori off country. And so the ownership or custodianship of country changed a lot. So it was actually quite confusing for colonists to know who actually, you know, had ownership or rights over land. So I don't think it was deliberate, but it did cause a lot of problems.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks for explaining that. We had another question from someone called Casey asking you, Kristyn, what year did you write your book and where can it be purchased?
Okay, sure. My book actually came out in 2012, so it's really nice to see that it's still available in some bookshops. So you can buy it online. The publisher is UNSW Press, and you can still actually buy it straight from them. I'm pretty sure I've seen it recently at Fuller's Bookshop in Hobart. Hobart Bookshop sometimes stocks it. I've even seen it at Mona.
Oh, wow.
And other bookshops around Tasmania as well. It's also possible to order the book. So if you prefer not to do online shopping, you can also order it. Your local bookshop would be able to order it for you.
That's fantastic, Kristyn. Thank you for answering all the questions that came through. Thank you for sharing all the work that you've done and the research you've done. It's been a really, really interesting episode, and we know that it's a really tough part of Australian history to hear about, but it's really important that we all know about it. So thank you so much, everyone, as well, for tuning in. And if you're watching a recording of the episode at a later stage, there's lots of things you can do. There'll be an activity that goes along with the episode that you can do, or you can make some reflection notes on the Children's University portal. But again, we just want to say thanks so much to Kristyn for coming, and we want to all let you know that we'll be broadcasting again in 2 weeks' time. Another researcher from the University of Tasmania will be coming on the show. Her name's Claire Hawkins. She does a lot of research around wedge-tailed eagles, and she's got some ideas for how you might be able to help her with her research by tracking the movements of the eagles as part of a survey she's doing with Tasmanians all around the state. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. See you later.
Thanks, bye.
See ya, bye.